For hypothesis 4, you're going to assess if people who are married or in a relationship will have a lower stress and score and better coping. So this is tying into what you've been reading about stress and coping in terms of the buffering effect of social support. Now to do this, because we're comparing two groups, we're going to compare those who are married or in a relationship, we're assuming that these are people who have consistent social support, and those who are single. Now, of course, I hope you're going to discuss, regardless of what these come out as, that doesn't necessarily indicate good social support if you're in a relationship, and there are many single people who have lots of social support through their friends and family network. But so this is just a very simple analysis that's tapping into stress and coping in one aspect of social support. So using a t-test, because we're going to be comparing groups, we're going to compare the stress and then the coping scores for each of those 8 subscales. So let's get our syntax up. And so for hypothesis 4, you can see where, if you remember, I made a new variable where I dichotomized relationships. There were 3 options you could have answered: single, in a relationship, or married, and I collapsed in a relationship and married. So it's telling SPSS to compare these two groups on these different variables. So the WOC, those are ways of coping, and you can see that we're going to look at each of the different types. So I'm going to go ahead and highlight all of this. And at the very end, you'll also see that we're looking at perceived stress in one of our t-tests. Run that. Let's scroll up a little bit to the start and walk through these. Okay, so first on confrontive coping. This is one of the subscales. You can see that we had 27 people who identified themselves as being single, 31 who identified themselves as married or in a relationship. You can see for confrontive coping, our single people have a slightly higher mean. Now, is this significant? If you look down at the t-score, it is not. That would need to be either greater than 1.96 or less than negative 1.96. And here is your p-value. So we don't see any difference for confrontive coping. We again see a higher score for planful problem solving with our single classmates, but this is not significant if you look at the p-value. Again, higher scores for escape avoidance, and this is also not significant. Higher scores on accepting responsibility, but this is not significant. Really very similar scores for seeking social support, and that's not surprising. That's not significant. Higher scores for self-controlling. And please look at these items to remind yourself what made up self-controlling, because a lot of that was sort of keeping things to yourself. And that is certainly approaching significance. That's very close, but it's not significant. So we can say that they seem to be using this more, but it's not in a statistically significant manner. In terms of distancing, it's higher scores again, but not significant. And very similar means for positive reappraisal. Not surprisingly, this is not significant. Okay, so our summary for coping, there's no different coping mechanisms for our single versus our people in a relationship or married. And I hope you can tie together lots of different ideas of why this could be. What are we not tapping into with this approach to looking at social support? And then finally, let's see, do we have higher perceived stress for people who are single or in a relationship? And you can see that there is slightly higher perceived stress for our single classmates, but this is not significant. So across the board, our hypothesis for is not supported. What are other things that you think we could have looked at? This could be a neat, you could propose what are some other variables that could have been introduced that would be a better proxy for social support than just if you were in a relationship or if you were single. So let's go ahead and run hypothesis 5. For hypothesis 5, this is what you need to cover in your discussion paragraph, and this is looking at people who report higher stress. So this is perceived and through the undergraduate stress questionnaire, and who are less effective using more avoidant coping, using the subscales such as distancing, self-controlling, accepting responsibility, and escape avoidance, that they're more likely to report more physical symptoms and being more bothered by these symptoms. So this hypothesis literally is tapping into how does stress and coping relate to health. And we'll be looking at the correlation between perceived stress, the undergraduate stress questionnaire, and the number of physical symptoms and the average of the severity of these symptoms that you filled out on your Qualtrics survey. So for hypothesis 5, you can see here's our correlation syntax, and we're doing the different ways of coping as well as the perceived stress, undergraduate stress questionnaire, and health. Now, if you'll recall, we're only interested in our hypothesis on 4, distancing, self-controlling, accepting responsibility, and escape avoidance. So let's go ahead and erase those others. Okay, so we have escape avoidance, accepting responsibility, self-controlling, and distancing. It's going to make our correlation matrix much easier to navigate. Oh, we had an error. So I made a mistake in my syntax. Let's double check what that could be. When you see an error like that, it means you typed in one of the variables incorrectly. So let's just double check that we have escape avoidance, accepting responsibility, self-controlling, and distancing. We go back and look at the variable view for these. Accepting responsibility, escape avoidance, distancing, and self-controlling. Those look like that they're spelled correctly. Perceived stress, undergraduate stress questionnaire. I think I know what may have happened. Yes, so we have not run our health syntax yet. So let me run that real fast. So right now, there's no health variable in there. So you're telling SPSS, run a correlation with this variable, and it's saying, wait a second, I don't even know what this variable is. So let me find that to run real fast. Here we go. Okay, so this will create our health variable. Go ahead and run that. And then if we look at our data set, now health is there. So go back to our syntax. Okay. So let's look at this last line because this is what we're really interested in. Do we see the health, so the physical symptom checklist, where higher scores mean that a student is having more physical symptoms to a greater severity? Do we see that related to different ways of coping? Looks like absolutely. Look at all those asterisks. So first, when we look at escape avoidance, those that are using escape avoidance as a coping mechanism have worse health outcomes. Similarly, those that are using accepting responsibility, self-controlling, and distancing. So all 4 of these coping mechanisms that are dealing more with avoiding or internalizing, being sort of self-critical, they all are related to worse physical outcomes. And not surprisingly, we're seeing those with higher perceived stress and those with higher scores in the undergraduate stress questionnaire also demonstrating higher or worse health outcomes. And in fact, I think this is the largest correlation we've seen. So that's a pretty strong magnitude showing that there's a good relationship between the number of events somebody is reporting and their health. So let's think about what are some bonus questions that you could run. And right now I'm going to do one as an example just to show you how to manipulate the syntax. You can just sit down with your group and sort of say, well, we had lots of variables and there were some things that we didn't look at. We didn't look at exercise. So you could try to see if that's related to stress or coping. We actually didn't look at gender. So let me give you an example for a t-test and for a correlation that you could do. All you need to do, so here is, I could copy this syntax right here and then paste it down here and just change the variable name. So I'm interested in gender instead of the relationship status, and I'm interested in, I'm going to look at stress. I'm hoping some of you might want to look at gender and the different coping skills. So if I look at their perceived stress, I'm trying to see, do males or females have more perceived stress? You just highlight it and run it. And we can look and say, well, no, they don't. It doesn't seem, it's non-significant. We do see that females are reporting slightly higher perceived stress, but this is not in a significant manner. Now, something, another one I want to give you an example of for these correlations. So say I want to do, I just showed you that for these more, these less adaptive coping skills, those are related to health quite strongly. But what about the better coping skills out of those 8 subskills? How is that related to health? So I'm going to look at health, and then I just need to change these names. So for our better coping skills, we know that one was seeking social support, and you could find all of these if you looked at the variable view. So we want to look at positive reappraisal, PR, planful problem solving, PPS. Let's write those in before we forget them. So we'll change this to PR, change this to PPS. And what's the fourth one? Seeking social support, planful problem solving. I think that's, let's minimize this. Okay, let's see with these 3 what we see. So we would want to see a negative relationship. We would hypothesize that these are better coping, and so they should help against health problems. Okay. And we're not, it's non-significant, and it is not how we were expecting. This is surprising. So I would think this would be negative. Those that are seeking social support more are going to have less health. But what we're seeing right here is that they're positively related. None are significant. These approach significance for positive reappraisal and planful problem solving. Now, one way that you could discuss this, if this would have been your bonus question, was that maybe people who are having to use these coping skills more, they have more stress, and so maybe that's why we're seeing greater or poor health outcomes, because they're having to actually go to these coping skills. People who aren't as stressed, aren't using coping as much because they don't need it, may report less health problems. So those are just some examples. We've covered hypothesis 4 and 5, and then what you can do if you want to try to do a bonus and try your own hypothesis.